Well, thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be with you tonight. How many of you would consider yourselves to be committed Christians? Okay. How many of you are pretty sure you're going to disagree with everything I say? Good. Just 3 of you. Very good. How many of you are being honest? It's a pleasure being with you. I started out my study of the New Testament and theology and my understanding of the world as a very committed Christian. When I was in high school, I had a born-again experience, and after high school went to the Moody Bible Institute, where I studied for 3 years to receive a diploma in Bible and theology. After Moody, I went to Wheaton College, which you students, I'm sure, all know. And after Wheaton, I went to the Princeton Theological Seminary, where I did a Master's of Divinity degree, being trained for ministry. After my Master's of Divinity degree, I was the pastor of the Princeton Baptist Church for a time. My point in mentioning this is that I want it to be clear that I started out as a firm believer, a solid evangelical Christian, and stood in the evangelical tradition for a number of years. My views changed over the years to what you will be hearing this evening, and I want to give you some sense for why they changed by explaining what happened to me and what happened to my thinking over a period of time. When I was doing my PhD at Princeton Theological Seminary, I was also teaching at Rutgers University, teaching undergraduates, and one semester I was asked to teach a class called The Problem of Suffering in the Biblical Traditions. This was a course that was designed to deal with what the Bible has to say about why there is suffering. The technical term for that kind of discourse about suffering is called theodicy. It's called theodicy. It comes from 2 Greek words, which mean God's justness. How can God be righteous, or how can God be just, given the state of affairs in this world? Given the misery and the suffering around the world, how is it all fair if a God is in control? If God is all powerful, if God is all loving, why is there suffering? This was in the 1980s, and frankly, at the time, I had trouble convincing my students at Rutgers that there was a problem of suffering. They tended to be middle-class students who were doing very well, thank you very much, and didn't realize, many of them, just how enormous the problem of suffering could be. This happened to be during one of the major Ethiopian famines, and so one of the things that I did was to bring in newspaper clippings and pictures from the newspaper of a woman who was starving to death, with a child at her breast who couldn't get any milk, who was also starving to death, and pointing this to my students and saying, this is a problem. How does one explain this if there is a God in charge of this world? Well, the class was not so much about the philosophical problems of suffering as about what the Bible has to say about it. And studying the Bible, what it has to say about it, my students and I came away with 2 major points that are quite interesting and relevant for tonight's debate. The first point is the Bible has a lot of things to say about suffering, but many of the things that different authors say about suffering in the Bible are at odds with one another. For example, in the Old Testament, the prophets, Amos, Hosea, Isaiah, page after page of the prophets proclaim that the reason God's people are suffering is because God is punishing them for their sins. They've done things wrong, and that's why God has brought so much misery upon them. Famine, drought, epidemics, military disaster. God is doing this to his people in order to get them to return to him. The book of Job disagrees with that point of view. According to the book of Job, people who do what God wants are the ones sometimes who suffer. It is the innocent who suffer. Whereas the prophets said if you would return to God and that the suffering then would be alleviated, Job indicates that people who turn to God, in fact, are the ones who experience the most misery. It is the innocent, not the guilty, who suffer, and God allows it even though he could stop it. The book of Daniel and the book of Revelation in the New Testament also disagree with the prophets. Daniel and Revelation indicate that it's not God who causes the problem of suffering, it's the forces of evil who cause suffering. And it's not against people who are guilty, as in the prophets, it's against people who are innocent. The book of Proverbs disagrees with all of the ones I've mentioned so far. In the book of Proverbs, it's neither God nor the forces of evil that are causing suffering. The universe, according to Proverbs, is set up in such a way that the righteous are rewarded and the sinners suffer. If you are righteous, according to Proverbs, you won't suffer. If you are sinful, you will. But that contradicts what Job had to say, that the innocent suffer. And Job is contradicted by what the prophets have to say, that God punishes only the guilty, and those who turn to God are rewarded. The first point that comes out by a study of suffering in the Bible is that the different biblical authors disagree with one another. There are discrepancies. The other point that came out in this class that I taught, that I realized, I think maybe for the first time in a big way while teaching this class, is that the Bible does not teach the point of view that many people hold today about why they're suffering. I would imagine that if we did a survey of all of you here tonight and asked you, why is there suffering, one of the principal reasons virtually everybody would say is it's because of free will. At Rutgers, I started calling this the robot explanation. I called it the robot explanation because that was the term everybody would use. It goes like this. If God had decided that we didn't have free will, we would all be programmed like robots. And we wouldn't be able to do anything we wanted to do. We would only do what we were programmed to do. But if we were programmed only to do good, of course there'd be no suffering because we wouldn't hurt one another. The fact that we have free will shows that we are not robots, and therefore we can do evil to one another. We can hurt one another. We can oppress one another. We can kill one another. This is, as I said, what I call the robot explanation, and the Bible actually does not have the robot explanation in it, in part because there are no robots in the Bible, but in part because the Bible has other explanations for why they're suffering, the ones that I've just given you a minute ago. There are, of course, hints in the Bible that people can do harm to other people. But as I studied the problem with this class at Rutgers, I came to realize that there are problems with this robot explanation. For one thing, it's an incomplete explanation that doesn't solve the problem of why they're suffering. You all will remember a tsunami that killed 300,000 people. Whose free will caused that? Or more recently, an earthquake in Haiti that killed 230,000 people. Whose free will caused that? The problem with the free will explanation is that it doesn't explain natural disasters. Moreover, I think the free will explanation is philosophically problematic for a reason that a lot of people haven't thought about. Most people I know who think that, who have the explanation that it's all because of free will, most people I know who advance that idea are themselves Christians. These are people who believe that when they die, they're going to go to heaven. They also believe that there will be no suffering in heaven. And so one might ask, will there be free will in heaven? If there's free will in heaven, but no suffering in heaven, that must mean that it is possible to have a world with free will, but without suffering. So why don't we have a world with free will without suffering? Well, it obviously wasn't set up that way, but it means that the free will explanation doesn't really explain the problem. Moreover, I should say that the free will explanation doesn't resolve what I would call the theological problem of suffering. The theological problem of suffering is very simple. If God is all-powerful, He can do anything that He wants. If He's all-loving, He doesn't want people to suffer, any more than you want people to suffering, and you're a loving person. God can do anything He wants. He doesn't want people to suffer, and yet people suffer. How does one explain that? Well, that's the problem of theodicy. Most Christians think that God intervenes in history, intervenes in our lives in order to deal with suffering. God intervenes in our lives in order to deal with suffering, so that when something goes wrong, we can pray about it and God will help resolve the problem. If that's the case, why doesn't God intervene more often? We all have experienced suffering in our lives, and we know of others who have. After I finished this class at Rutgers, I experienced a lot of suffering myself, as did other people. Cancer, taking away loved ones in the prime of life, teenage suicide, birth defects, failed marriages, a friend who escaped the killing fields of Cambodia, homelessness, poverty, starvation. We all know people who have had these problems. I kept reading about issues pertaining to suffering. The Holocaust, 6 million Jews murdered in cold blood. Genocides in Cambodia, Bosnia, Rwanda, Darfur. A flu epidemic in 1918 that killed 30 million people worldwide. The flu. World poverty and starvation. I came to a point where none of the biblical answers or traditional answers were satisfying to me. Most of the Bible has one thing in common. It believes in a God who intervenes in our world. That is the basis for the traditions in the Old Testament of God saving the children of Israel and making them his people. It's the basis for the belief in Jesus' cross and resurrection, that God intervened in our world for good. God's intervention is what's behind our idea that prayer works. But if God intervenes, why doesn't he? In our world, every 5 seconds, a child dies of starvation. Every 5 seconds. In our world, every minute, 25 people die from diseases from unclean water. Every hour, 300 people die of malaria. If God intervenes, why doesn't he intervene? The Holocaust, genocides, terrorist attacks, starvation, poverty, tsunamis, hurricanes, earthquakes. Eventually, the answers did not satisfy me, and I came to be unable to affirm the very basis of my Christian faith. I became an agnostic. I no longer believe in the God of the Bible. I do not believe in a good and all-powerful God who intervenes in this world. Let me stress that it's not my goal to make anyone else an agnostic, and it's not my goal to deconvert anyone from whatever their faith is. It's not my goal, it's not my desire at all. It is my goal to get people to think, and to be more tolerant of people who think differently from them. Many of you who are Christian would agree with the statement that God loves you and has a wonderful plan for your life. But does God love everyone and have a wonderful plan for their lives? Even for those who are starving to death, who are crushed with horrible diseases, who are crippled with pain, whose lives have been torn apart by the death of a loved one? Does God love the homeless, the hungry, the maimed, the murdered? Then why doesn't he do something about it? One viable response is to say that God wants us to do something about it. And I absolutely would agree with that, if I believed in God, that God wants us to do something about it. We should do something about suffering in our world. We should commit ourselves to doing something about our suffering in our world. We should work to alleviate the suffering in our world. Absolutely, yes. But that doesn't answer the theological question. Why doesn't God intervene? I can't believe in a God who intervenes in the world to make it a better place. If you do believe in such a God, you need to figure out how to reconcile your faith with the facts of reality. How do you make sense of this world of pain, misery, and suffering without coming away with a simple answer? A basic answer, a simple answer. how do you have something that matches the complexity of the suffering? This is the biggest question you will ever face as a Christian and even as a human being. Why is there pain and misery and suffering in the world? It's a question that we should all acknowledge. And whether or not we find a satisfying answer, we should all realize that there is enormous suffering out there, and all of us, Christian and non-Christian alike, should do everything we can to relieve it and to help those in need.
Hello, everyone. It's a real honor and a thrill to be up here discussing an issue of such urgency and importance. The problem of suffering is not a problem that is confined to atheists or agnostics. It's in fact a problem even more intensely felt by the believer. Because for the atheist, in some ways, suffering is not a problem. There is no God, so this is just the way the world is. For the believer, however, you always have to ask, why does God permit, tolerate, cause a world that looks like the one we have? Now, in some senses, this is a very difficult question to raise because we are second-guessing God. We're basically saying God is an architect. He made the world this way, and we think he could have done better. Barth Ermann says, in the sense, that how do we make sense of the world? So the first problem we have, I think, as not just Christians, but as thinking people is, what position are we in to judge the architecture of the universe? In other words, before we undertake a project of reason to explain something, you've got to ask, am I in possession of adequate facts to comment intelligently on the matter at hand? If you show up and somebody says, here's a bunch of clues, don't look at them, but tell me who the murderer is, you'll say, well, I can't. I don't know what these clues actually mean. If you go into a mall, or you're outside in the parking lot, and you see a big SUV, and the door is open, and there's a 2-year-old child in a car seat, but it's hot, and there's no mom anywhere to be seen, what do you say? Do you say that this mom is a negligent person who should be immediately arrested and locked up because she has no idea how to look after her child? No, because you don't know the mom. She might have excellent reason for running out of that SUV. Maybe her husband is in Starbucks and just had a heart attack. And since you are not in full possession of the relevant facts, you hold back a little bit. You don't know the circumstances over there. And so here we are, human beings. We are part of the universe. And we are second-guessing the blueprint of the entire universe. So my first question is, are we really in full possession of adequate facts to be able to say, we think God could have done better? That's the question that's worth thinking about. Does our human reason have that kind of a compass? Or are we rather more like the ant or the dog, which if given an algebra problem can use all its reason, but still wouldn't in fact solve the problem? Not because there isn't a solution, but because the abilities of the ant are not adequate to comprehend it, or not in possession of the adequate data to give an adequate answer. Now, when we think about evil, when we think about suffering, in some ways to me this is not a problem about the existence of God. You can say it's a problem about the character of God. In some ways, very often people say there's so much suffering in the world, therefore we are very doubtful that there is a God who exists, who would permit such a thing. But let's imagine, for instance, that I have a dad who's very powerful, who has near infinite resources. Let's say my dad is Bill Gates. And I consider him to be a very loving dad and a very powerful man, and I look to him whenever I'm in difficulty. And then I come across a really serious problem in my life, and I look to my father and say, help me, and he won't help. He isn't there. So what do I conclude? Do I say, well, my dad does not exist? No. I simply say, maybe my dad isn't quite the guy I thought he was. Maybe I need to reassess my relationship with my dad. Maybe my dad isn't the person I suspected him to be. In other words, I begin to reassess the character of my dad. I don't necessarily question his existence. Well, to me, one fascinating aspect of the book of Job is that there is no flinching from suffering. In Christianity, there is no flinching from suffering. There are other religions, Hinduism and so on, which define suffering as somehow illusory, Maya, but not in Christianity. There's looking suffering right in the face. And yet, interestingly, in the book of Job, while a lot of people speculate why is there suffering, it never occurs to anyone in the book to say that there's no God. It never occurs to Job to say God does not exist. That denial of God's existence is in some ways a modern phenomenon excavated out of contemporary suffering. Now, why is there suffering? Usually in thinking about this problem of suffering or problem of evil, we have to make a distinction between what can be called moral evil on the one hand and natural suffering on the other. So moral evil refers to bad things that are done by human beings. Moral agents do moral evil. And then, of course, there's natural suffering. I won't call it natural evil because there's nothing evil about a tsunami. A tsunami by itself isn't evil. Now, the wreckage it causes is terrible. But I'll call it natural suffering rather than natural evil because it's not performed by a human agent. So first we talk about moral evil. And in some senses, I think the defense raised by Barth Ermann, which he didn't actually rebut, was that moral evil is comprehensible within the framework of free will. It is a fact that if you are going to have free will, you're going to have to choose between right and wrong, between good and evil. To remove free will is to remove that ability to choose. It isn't necessarily to make us robots, but it is in some sense to make us inhuman. In fact, what do we call people who don't have the ability to choose right from wrong? We call them psychopaths or sociopaths. They're people in a sense who are less than human because they don't have that ability to choose. So when people often say, and Barth had a litany of moral horrors from Rwanda to the Holocaust to the killing fields of Cambodia, did God do those things? No. Human beings did them. Don't blame God for the Holocaust. That was Hitler and the Nazis. Who did the killing fields of Cambodia? Well, that was the atheist Pol Pot and his Khmer Rouge regime, which in the aftermath of the Vietnam War, in 3 years wiped out some 2 million people. Rwanda, the Hutus, the Tutsis, tribal hatreds, human beings inflicting terrible things on each other. And that is, in a sense, the great burden of moral choice. If you do something terrible, it's going to hurt innocent people who had no say in the matter. It gives you the awesome burden or responsibility of free choice. I'll come back and talk about the issue of free will in heaven, but in general, the argument that moral evil can be explained as a result of God creating us in His image, which is to say free like Him, in some senses co-creators of circumstances in the universe. And that allows us to do some terrible things to each other. But then Barth rightly says that that's not the end of the story, because you do have terrible things that happen that human beings had nothing to do with. Tsunamis, hurricanes, natural suffering that seems to come out of, you might say, the laws of nature. And in some ways, Barth says if God is omnipotent, He could intervene. In fact, you might raise the question, why have laws of nature in the first place? No laws of nature, no hurricanes, no tsunamis, no earthquakes. Why did God create a lawful universe? Actually, there are some people who think He didn't. The Muslim scholar Al-Ghazali says there are no laws. God intervenes at every second to make things happen as they do. In some senses, the alternative to a lawful universe is, you might say, a discretionary universe. Everything happens because God wills it. And it doesn't have to happen the same way twice. So if you drop a pen, it goes to the ground, but the next time you drop it, it goes right up. That would be a whimsical universe, unpredictable. Now, try to think about this, because Barth said, free will cannot be used to defend against natural evil. I insist that it can. Because in a whimsical universe, human action would have no predictable consequence. If I were to pull out a gun to shoot you, God could block the bullet. And therefore my action of trying to kill you, my evil action, is meaningless because you're not going to feel any pain. Because a magical hand is going to come in the way and whisk off the bullet. So in other words, if we don't have a lawful universe, in some senses, human action in the world becomes impossible. Our freedom, we might still be free, but our freedom would carry no consequence because it would be completely unpredictable what was going to happen next. Now, of course, we could still have a lawful universe with miracles. In other words, let's have laws, but God just intervenes like once in a while, maybe every 6 weeks. Not intervenes with little nuisances. He doesn't block the common cold, but maybe he blocks the horrible hurricanes and tsunamis that kill tens of thousands of people. Now, interestingly, when you look at the Bible, there are a lot of miracles. But to my understanding, these miracles, by and large, are aimed at, you might say, spiritual benefits, and not to contravene the laws of nature for their own sake. In other words, God parts the Red Sea for the Israelites to cross. Jesus heals the blind man, but he doesn't heal blindness. The purpose is conversion. It's spiritual. There is a contravention of a law of nature, but it's occasional, it's rare, and it's done for a spiritual purpose. At no point can I find miracles that are done just because God decides that this law, in fact, think about it. If God had to do miracles that way, it's kind of a way of saying that my laws are defective. I create a factory to spit out cars, but a bad one comes out every now and then. I've got to do a miracle to correct it. That's a defect. Why do we have earthquakes? The reason we have earthquakes, and by the way, this is not an argument from the Bible. This is an argument from geology. The reason we have earthquakes is underneath the earth are massive tectonic plates that move. And these tectonic plates, it turns out, are absolute prerequisites for life on Earth to exist. In fact, interestingly, scientists have looked for plate tectonics and have not found them on any other known star or planet. They are unique to Earth. And the point I'm getting at here is not merely that you need plate tectonics, because plate tectonics ultimately separate the land from the oceans. If you didn't have plate tectonics, our planet, mostly made up of water, the water would swallow the land, and Earth would be essentially a water world up to a depth of about 400 feet. I get this fact from a book called Rare Earth, written by the geologist Peter Ward and the astronomer Donald Brownlee. The point being that plate tectonics is an absolute prerequisite for life itself to exist on the Earth. And here we can make a broader point. And that is, as scientists study the laws of nature, all the laws, the constants of nature, the speed of light, the electromagnetic force, the strong nuclear force, they have come up with something that is sometimes called the anthropic principle, or the principle of fine-tuning. And here's what it means. The laws of the universe are fine-tuned for life. You could have other laws, but if you did, you would not end up with creatures like us. You might not end up with life at all. But if you did, you would not get human beings at the end. There's a rather startling theological point hiding here. The anthropic principle, by the way, usually used to try to prove the existence of some kind of an intelligent designer. I'm not using it for that purpose. I'm saying something a little different. Modern science shows that this universe cannot function with other laws. That if you had other laws, you wouldn't get Homo sapiens at the end of it. So yes, God could have made other laws, but you'd get a different kind of creature at the end of the process. So if God wanted to use a lawful process and wanted to create creatures like us, modern science tells us that this is the recipe. The laws that exist here and now are the necessary prerequisite for us being here. Now, these laws are in some senses double-edged. The sunshine that makes life possible is also the sunshine that gives us wrinkles and sometimes exposes us to radiation, cancer. The water that we drink without which we couldn't have life, well, you can drown in it. And so these laws are of such a kind that they can by themselves impose hardship, impose suffering. But here's the other side of it. God has at the same time given us the tools to comprehend these laws and in some ways to overcome them. That is called modern science. And therefore, you can have malaria, but we have a cure for malaria. If you want to know why people are getting malaria right now and suffering and dying from it, that's because this cure that we have already is not being adequately and widely enough distributed. It exists. The fault, in other words, here is not with a God who allows malaria, but with human beings who do not take the actions to, in a sense, achieve the kind of world that God made it possible for us to live in. Thank you very much.
Thinking of questions you might have for our speakers this evening.
Well, I'd like to thank Dnesh for that very interesting and powerful statement. I wish my Rutgers students had been so smart. I don't think anybody needs to be second-guessing God when it comes to why there's suffering in the world. Asking why there is suffering is not second-guessing God. Presumably, everybody thinks that God gave human beings extraordinary intelligence. I'm simply asking that we use our intelligence to try to understand our world. It's not challenging God to ask why there is suffering in the world. Dnesh says, what position are we in to ask the question of suffering? Well, we're in the position of being intelligent people who have brains, and we should use them. The book of Job is probably the best known instance of somebody questioning why there is suffering. In the book of Job, Job wants to know why, since he is innocent, he's suffering, and he demands that God appear to him and tell him why he's suffering. God finally does appear to Job, but instead of answering Job's question to tell him why he's suffering, God says, "Who are you to ask me? I am almighty and you are a peon." God squashes Job under his mighty thumb, and Job writhes on the ground in dust and ashes and repents for even asking. Is that what we should do in the face of the big questions that we have to ask? Should we writhe on the ground and say, well, I'm not going to ask the question because it's too deep for me to understand? Should we admit that we can't know and so we're not going to ask? I don't think so. I don't think the example of Bill Gates deciding to withhold a computer from his son so that his son thinks Bill Gates is somebody different from whom he really thought he was is really an appropriate or an adequate explanation of what we're dealing with the problem of suffering. God is not Bill Gates, and he didn't withhold a computer from a son. There are people starving to death in this world. Yes, if God's in charge of this world, he must be different from what we thought. But where does that leave us? What is he really like? God does intervene in the world according to traditional Jewish and Christian thinking. And my guess is that Dnesh thinks that God intervenes in the world and that he answers prayer. If that's the case, why is it there's so much suffering? Now, Dnesh differentiates between moral evil and natural evil, and he points out that God did not cause the Holocaust. Fair enough. Of course God didn't cause the Holocaust, and nobody said that God caused the Holocaust. But does God answer prayer or not? When 6 million of his people are crying out to help, does he answer or not? If you think the answer is no, he does not answer prayer, what does that do to your faith? And what does it do to Dnesh's faith? Does God intervene in this world or not? Or maybe he didn't like those Jews. Maybe he would have saved the Christians. Really? Maybe God likes us better than the people who are starving to death because we had a very nice dinner, thank you very much. So maybe God's on our side, but he's not on the side of the people who are suffering. Is that what we want to think? Is that going to be our theology? I simply don't buy the idea that the laws of nature are the way they have to be or we could not have life. I think that this is not a solid argument in the least. Who made the laws of nature? You say, well, if you had some other laws, then it wouldn't work this way. We couldn't have Homo sapiens. Right. Within the framework of nature as we have it now, we have to have tectonic plates. You mean God could not create a world without tectonic plates? There have to be tsunamis that kill 300,000 people? Really? There have to be? You're telling me that God couldn't do something different? God couldn't dream up a world without tectonic plates? How limited is God? Is God so limited that he could not create a world without earthquakes and hurricanes and tsunamis and droughts? Is that really the case, that God couldn't do it? If that's what you think, then I would say you're probably leaning more toward my direction. I don't believe that, in fact, there could be a God who causes suffering or allows suffering if he could prevent it. And I don't believe if there was an all-powerful God in the world that, in fact, you could say that he can't prevent it. Thank you.
The Christian view of God is that God is salvation, right? The Bible says salvation is the gift of God. Now, for many years, I used to think that the Bible was saying that salvation is the gift from God. But no, it doesn't say that. Salvation is the gift of God. God is the gift. God is the gift. Now, we as human beings have the free choice of saying yes to the gift or no. So easy as God made it that all we have to do, no matter what the wreckage of our lives, no matter what the sins we've committed, all we have to do is utter the word yes. That's it. That's the only prerequisite for salvation. That does it. So if someone says no in the face of a yes and you may enter sign, and if God himself is salvation, to say no to God is to say no to what God is. That is my definition of hell. If God is goodness, purity, beauty, truth, and you say no to God, you are cutting yourself off voluntarily from those divine attributes by your own will. And what does God do? God merely acquiesces in your free choice. So, this is the simple paradigm. There are multiple tough cases. What about the Hindu who's lived a decent life and has never heard of Jesus Christ? I'm not addressing those cases.
I noticed.
But I'm not ducking them either. I'm not ducking them. And I'm happy to address the issue, because here I think we have a different question, which is, the Bible says clearly that Jesus is the only way to salvation. And I believe that. Some people interpret that to mean something else. All those who have not explicitly accepted Jesus go to hell. That is one possible interpretation of the other statement, but not the only one. And in fact, there are many Christians who do not interpret the first statement in the Bible to mean the second statement, which is an interpretation of the Bible. Therefore, if you were to ask me, what happens to the guy in Papua New Guinea who's never heard of God or never heard of Jesus? My answer is, I don't know. I leave that to God's infinite mercy and justice. But no, I'm not declaring that that guy goes to hell, because I'm not sure that Bible statement A leads to interpretation B. My turn. Do we have time? Okay.
One last question.
I'm sorry?
Oh, I'm sorry.
Oh, yeah.
One last question. It's all yours.
Suffering ultimately is not an intellectual problem. It's an emotional problem. If you lose a child, you might wonder why But really, your main concern is to alleviate the suffering. How do I feel better? How do I have this wound bandaged and overcome? So here's my question. Who has a better practical remedy for suffering? The Christian who can say this to someone, you've lost your son, but you have the hope of an afterlife in which you'll see him again. Offering genuine consolation to a bereaved person in that circumstance. Or an atheist who says, stuff happens. You've lost your son. There's no explanation. There's no remedy. Get over it. As a practical matter, who has more resources for coping with suffering? The Christians, who started the Red Cross, innumerable organizations to alleviate suffering? Or atheism, which basically says, this is the world as it is?
Yeah, actually my view of this, you might be surprised to find, isn't going to be your view. I think easy answers in the face of real suffering are cruel. I think when you have your son commit suicide or your daughter get killed by a drunk driver, or your wife die because of an aneurysm, that the simple comfort of, don't worry, they're in heaven now, really doesn't go very far. I think it's a platitude that, in fact, I find offensive, because it doesn't take seriously the real nature of suffering. And I'm, frankly, throughout this entire debate, I've been puzzled a little bit by what seems to me almost an intellectualizing of the problem on your part. That you can kind of solve it by coming up with clever answers. And this just strikes me like a slogan. I think that the way you comfort somebody is you do what the friends of Job did when he was suffering. They didn't give him platitudes. They came up to him and they sat with him in silence for 3 days. You show your human support for a fellow human being. You put your arm around the person and you tell them that you feel for them and that you love them and that you're there for them. And in my opinion, that does a world more good than a platitude about the afterlife.
Well, Bart, let's look at this for a moment, because that's a very revealing statement. None of us knows what comes after death, right? You haven't been to the other side of the curtain.
No, I know, but you just said you did.
No.
You said
No, I didn't say I did. I said you are offering someone
earlier
the hope.
you talked about people living forever in the afterlife, having suffered here, and
I
now
said-
you've
I
just said that this
that
person
is
is in heaven.
I said it's a central proposition of Christian theology, which it is.
And you agree with it, don't you?
And I agree with it on the basis of revelation, but I
Well,
want
okay.
I want to come to your point. As a matter of reason, engaging you as an agnostic, right? Here we have death, it's the final wall or curtain. None of us have been to the other side, right?
There is no other side.
Well, there's something that comes after death, whether it's life after or nothing. But what my point is, we are not in a position to know.
Something is not nothing.
Either there is life after death or there isn't.
Yeah.
Can you
there's
think
no
of a
other
third option?
There's no other side. That's a nothing. That's not a something.
All right.
You wrote a book about it.
The point I'm trying to make is that you are declaring to be a platitude something that is very much an open question, a real possibility. In other words,
and you're admitting it's a possibility you don't even agree with.
no, I'm in a normal debate, if we were debating the existence of God, the burden of proof would be on me, because I'm saying there's a God, and I would need to prove it. In this debate, the burden of proof is on you, because you're saying there is an inherent inconsistency between Christian theology, the Christian God, all-powerful, benevolent, and the framework around that God, and the reality of suffering. So I am perfectly permitted to say, okay, let's see if there is this stated inconsistency. This theology posits the afterlife. I don't have to prove it. I'm simply saying, once you look at the full framework, the inconsistency disappears.
Yes, you've intellectualized the problem.
That's why we're having a debate. But I don't mean to imply that suffering doesn't remain a deep problem or a deep mystery. The point I wanted to make about life after death is there is something in human nature that longs for life to go on. Cultures throughout history and all religions have posited the afterlife as an arena of cosmic justice. Now, they could be making it up, but they could also be right. So why would you dismiss a real possibility which gives real hope and real consolation as a platitude?
Because it is a platitude. You're saying it's okay.
What's a platitude? Is it a statement?
The platitude is that you have just told somebody whose daughter was killed in a car wreck that it's okay because she'll be in heaven now.
I don't think I said it was okay. I said that despite the intensity of this suffering,
this does not provide comfort.
It has for millions of people through history.
It's created enormous guilt as well. It's created terrible suffering from people who think that they shouldn't mourn somebody because, after all, it was God's will.
It's created pain for people who feel that their mourning is inadequate because they should be actually mourning more.
Most people feel like, if my child is in heaven, then it should be okay. Well, it's not okay.
If I may. Our first question, which each of you will get at this time, we'll pause the debate for a second. The ushers will be coming down the aisles, both the sides and the center, to collect the questions you have.
All right, so Dnesh, I want to know whether you believe that God answers prayer. And if you do think so, do you think that God sometimes does intervene in our world? And the more involved part of that is, if you think that God does not answer prayer, then I'd like to know, and that he doesn't intervene, I'd like to know in what sense you consider yourself a Christian. If you do think that God answers prayer and does intervene, then I'd like to know whether it bothers you that God doesn't answer prayer for people who are starving to death and being tortured and who are being murdered and so forth.
I think that God can and does answer prayer. I think that God can and does intervene in the world. He has, and I believe he still does. However, I see this intervention in the world as rare, as an expression of God's gratuitous love, and something that does not occur on a regular basis. In fact, if it did, there would be we could no longer speak of the lawfulness of nature. So a miracle, by definition, is a rare contravention of a natural law. But I do believe it does happen and has happened. Okay, for my turn. The problem of evil is often seen as a problem for the believer. I want to suggest it is a problem also for the unbeliever. Because if there is no God, is it not a fact that we are evolved primates, Darwinian creatures, if you will, in the world, struggling to survive and reproduce without an intelligent designer or a benign creator? Now, if that is the case, here's my question. Isn't it true that the magnitude of human evil defies Darwinian explanation? And what I mean by this is that there is evil in nature, but evil in nature seems very frugally confined to survival. A lion might eat an antelope. But have we ever met a lion that wants to abolish every antelope off the face of the earth? There's no lion Hitler, if you will. A lion will, when hungry, kill, but human evil outstrips Darwinian necessity. You have people who want to wipe out entire tribes, and there's torture and cruelty that seems, again, to go far beyond the needs of survival and reproduction. So what is your explanation? If we are Darwinian primates, wherefore comes this kind of evil? What's its source?
Yeah, that's a great question. I'm not sure I'm convinced that human evil far surpasses what you find in the animal kingdom. And I don't know what criteria one uses to establish what would be human evil that goes up to a certain level, but beyond that, well, there must be a God. That doesn't make sense to me. But I'm thinking about my cat right now. Now, my cat loves torture. When it gets a mouse, it doesn't kill the mouse because it's hungry. It tortures the mouse it'll torture for hours if I let it. This is something that simply happens in the animal kingdom. Hitler was an oversized mouse. I think that the Holocaust is, I think, more readily explicable if humans have no constraints on them from above than it is by assuming that there's a God who answers prayer. And so I don't see it as really a problem for, you keep referring to atheists, which I would consider myself to be an agnostic. I consider the enormity of evil in the world to be a much bigger problem for somebody who has faith in a God who created this world and is in some sense sovereign over this world and occasionally intervenes in this world. It's a much bigger problem for somebody of that sort than for somebody who simply says that it is, in fact, there's no divine person over this world in control of it, no loving creator who is in charge of it, that in fact we're just here by ourselves, and that's why there are tsunamis and earthquakes and hurricanes and holocausts. My turn. Right. You suggested that somebody who suffers now may experience 1 billion years of happiness in the afterlife, and that therefore I'm not looking at the whole of Christian theology, only at a very small sliver. And you said that I would prefer that we all lead a hedonist life here on earth. I guess I want to know whether you believe in hell, and whether people are punished in hell, and whether it's an eternal punishment, and whether God loves the people who are suffering eternal punishment in hell. I'm especially thinking of, for example, somebody in, let's say, in some part of Africa, say in southern Africa, who has gotten AIDS, or somebody who is not a Christian, who has gone through horrible suffering here in this world and then dies and suffers torment for billions of years. So I want to know whether you believe that, and if so, how that relates to your understanding of God.
Well, I'll answer the question. I want to address, before I do, very briefly, the example that you gave about the cat and the mouse, because I think it is in a sense, based on a fallacy. The mouse who is being tortured by your cat is not being tortured in any sense that we mean the word torture. If someone is torturing me by playfully tossing me up and down with a big bayonet waiting for me to land on it, the reason I'm being tortured is that I can anticipate death. I can see it. I can imagine it. I have the cognitive faculties to apprehend it. And therein lies the torture. The torture is that I'm being playfully dangled before I'm going to be killed in a manner that I can anticipate. There's absolutely no sense that a mouse has the cognitive faculties. In fact, it seems that no animal does, to be able to foresee death, to know what death is like, to know that it is going to die.
Why does it try to escape?
Because it has a survival instinct built into it, which is Darwinian.
So
but that doesn't mean it has the cognitive faculty to know, I will die, human beings all die, death comes to everyone. The natural instinct that says run away when you see the lion is not the same as the one that... And in the example that you give, the anticipation is necessary for the torture to make sense. Otherwise, if the cat is dangling the mouse and the mouse feels nothing except I'm being dangled up and down, there is no torture.
Does the child who is thrown on the bayonet know that he's going to die?
No. But in that case, the evil is in the intention of the person doing it. And in this case, the question is whether the cat dangling the mouse is itself engaging in torture in the same way that the Nazis did when they treated the Jews in the way they did. Okay, let's talk about hell. Having settled that one.